Hey, happy Monday.
Happy Monday. How you doing, Joe?
Doing great. How was your weekend?
It was good. I was dealing with some vaccine side effects yesterday, which that just amounted to feeling kind of achy and tired. But I'm glad to have my vaccination series done and looking forward to like 2 weeks full immunity. So, well, not
Well,
full, but like
congrats.
near 100%, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah,
That's awesome. Congrats. Yeah, you're in
yeah,
the home stretch.
yeah. I mean, you got pretty sick this week, but yeah, it's great to have vaccines after being locked away for a year.
Yeah, yeah. I think you had a much better experience in your second shot than I did. I was pretty laid out. So,
Yeah.
but cool. On that cheery note, let's talk about an article that we've both been reading over the weekend here. It is what is the open data ecosystem and why it's here to stay?
Yeah, and great article. It resonates, I think, with a lot of our ideas. We don't agree with it 100%. We never do. We're very opinionated, but yeah, just an interesting take on things. And we thought we would give our response today.
Yeah, and I think we're going to discuss a couple articles here. So we're going to discuss
Yeah,
this open data ecosystem article, and then I think sort of an ancillary article from Snowflake, actually some of the people who wrote Snowflake, choosing open wisely. So we'll talk about both. Let's start with the open data ecosystem, though. What's your take on this?
yeah. So a lot of the stuff about Hadoop really resonated with me. I mean, I dealt with Hadoop in jobs with clients, and very powerful data processing engine. But the limitations they talk about here very much resonate with my experience. And so I kind of, one thing I slightly disagree with is they talk about Hadoop creating this open data ecosystem. The problem I ran into with Hadoop, and I think this resonates with other people, is that interop was poor, right? The code was open, but it had a hard time talking to other types of systems. Like everything you wanted to do, if you wanted to talk to Teradata, Oracle, or anything, it was extra work. And I feel like that's one of the things that really hampered Hadoop. And that's going to be a major theme of this talk today, actually, is interop, right? Fundamentally, can you communicate between different types of systems and different types of processes?
Yeah, so interop, also known as interoperability, for
Yeah, yeah.
for people who like
Shortening it a bit.
yeah. So in
Yeah,
case you're wondering that interop is an acronym
yeah,
or
yeah,
short for something. So
yeah.
yeah, yeah, I tend to agree with that. Yeah, I think the article did a really good job at going through sort of the history of early efforts at open data. And I think in this context, there's a couple facets to open data, right? There's the open source aspect of it,
Right.
which we can talk about. There's also the interoperability aspect, which we can also talk about. And actually, let's talk about some of the um, sort of the tenets of uh, the open data ecosystem. So,
Yeah.
the ethos really, right, defined by the following principles: openness, modularity, diversity. I think these are that encapsulates a lot of what's going on right now in the modern open data movement. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. And specifically in the cloud, right? So if you have on-prem systems, there's always extra friction to get them to talk to each other. In the cloud, typically systems and services are designed to communicate and talk to each other very easily. And the cloud typically offers these nice authentication mechanisms. So you can click a few boxes to authorize, and then you can have Snowflake talking to Spark, for example. Um, and so, yeah, these things, I mean, the notion of openness, open technologies, and open data standards, I think for us specifically, that means that I can connect any system to any other system for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and whether we're talking about open source technologies, managed services, et cetera, right? The fact that you can theoretically plug and play and swap things in and out, regardless of where you are in the life cycle, like that tends to be an attractive selling point. I think we'll get into maybe some of the current um, limitations of this approach right now
Mm-hmm.
and some of our
Mm-hmm.
thoughts. Um, Modularity, I think this is another piece that's moving away from monolithic architectures and towards a disaggregated software stack. So
Yeah, and I think with the traditional on-prem enterprise approach to software, modularity was severely hampered by a handful of things. So specifically, contracts were a big issue. In other words, every time I brought a new piece of infrastructure into my ecosystem, I typically required a new contract. And theoretically, Hadoop was going to prevent this. But the reality is that people ended up signing these contracts with Hadoop vendors. And so if I wanted Hadoop, if I wanted different components of Hadoop, I probably needed yet another contract to do that. And so in the cloud, I can just, things are typically turnkey. I can turn on a solution, use it as long as I need to, and then turn it off when I'm done with it.
Right. Yep. And then finally, diversity, which in this case is a reliance on a variety of dedicated tools for different use cases with diverse vendors that compete to drive value for customers. So yeah, we've seen an explosion in the number of data tools out there, whether they fit into the open data ecosystem or not. There's just a lot of data tools competing. I think across every niche that you can think of right now. So highly, highly competitive space. And so, I mean, I think this is a good rubric to describe the modern data ecosystem. I think we can get into some of the critiques right now. I think what we are seeing is, when it comes to modularity, for example, you might be moving away from monolithic architecture toward a disaggregated software stack. I'm not there's sometimes I think that's good. And other times I actually don't see an advantage per se, because it really comes down to whether or not you understand the various tools that you're implementing, right? And where they fit into the data lifecycle. If you're simply just swapping out a monolith for a bunch of black boxes, I'm not sure what you gained in that process. And in fact, I actually think you might be at a worse position, arguably, because now you have n number of black boxes that you can't reason about.
Yeah, and that we are fond of talking about resume-driven development, right? Where developers, data engineers turn on a new piece of technology just because they want to be able to check a box on their resume and say, hey, I've used Apache Beam, for example, I've used Google Cloud, whatever. Modularity is great, but you still need typically expertise in the different components that you're deploying. Yep. And so if you deploy them without really thinking, without understanding them, yeah, like you said, you end up worse off. You spend more money and you accomplish less.
Yeah, and I think, and we talk about openness here, right? A shift towards open technologies and data standards, as well as interoperability, instead of being locked in with a single proprietary vendor. Now, this is, I think, a great, it's a great tagline, I think, to sort of, describe why open source is better than being locked in. But here's the deal. If lock-in exists, whether or not you're going to be an open source, or whether you're with a vendor or, whatever. And anyone who's built systems, has to manage systems, knows this.
That's right. Yeah. And I think a lot of enterprises that invested in Hadoop a few years back are now stuck maintaining that infrastructure and trying to decide how to move on from Hadoop toward maybe a cloud data warehouse, toward maybe Spark or some other framework. And it's not easy.
It's not easy at all. So there's lock-in across the board. And I would say too, what I find interesting is that a lot of these open source tools that you see in the open data ecosystem, a lot of these are also startups that have gotten venture funding that are trying to create a managed SaaS solution on top, which indicates there's some sort of proprietary lock-in at the end of the day. So I don't know that you escape lock-in, whether it's proprietary lock-in or even just open source lock-in, right? So I think our argument has always been, pick something that you like to be locked in with. So and then figure out what your exit strategy is, right?
Yep. It's like before you go into Vietnam, say, what's your exit strategy? How are you going to get out, or Afghanistan or whatever conflict? It's not so different. It's like, I'm deploying open source code, but if I need to get out of it, then what am I going to have to do? If I'm deploying to Google Cloud or Snowflake or whatever, what am I going to have to do to escape from this situation in the future? Because at some point you'll probably want to. So have a plan ready to go when that happens.
Yeah, definitely have a plan. Yeah. Always. And a plan to learn the tools too, right? Like we talked about earlier, just because it's open source doesn't mean that there isn't a learning curve, and it still doesn't, remove the the requirement that you need to know your tools. If you're just bolting a bunch of black boxes together, that's great until it's not. So I know that the complexity is reduced on paper, but when something breaks, which it probably will, how are you going to diagnose it?
Yeah. And I think we've seen this again and again, right? So with Snowflake and BigQuery, it tends to be that teams want to deploy update strategies that they were using with Oracle. So like lots and lots of updates. That doesn't really work with columnar data.
We're talking about data updates, by the way, too, not software updates.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about like update statements or merge statements. It's a huge mess if you don't understand how columnar databases work.
Yeah, I see this a ton. Yeah. And finally, I'm going to say, just calling it out. I think there's a lot of companies out there that are slapping open source, the open source label, and I think there's a lot of open source washing going on, in the industry. So, if you're a manager or part of a tech team, just be aware that not all open source is created equal. I would definitely be looking at the community around an open source project and understand, does that community have great involvement in this project? Like, what's the state of this project? Is there a roadmap? How committed is this company to this open source project, or are they simply just slapping an open source label on their product just to make it look a bit more appealing to people who are interested in the open data ecosystem, right? It kind of reminds me of like like organic food labels and stuff. It's to me it's a very similar phenomenon. I think early in organic food, you saw people just companies were throwing organic everywhere, and there weren't really any standards around it yet, right? And that changed, but it was, you could pretty much kind of circumvent the labeling a bit. And I see the same thing happening in open source. And I would also add too, there's a lot of ceremony over open source. Like this tends to be like the one true way you have to go. Like at the end of the day, pick tools that work for you and make your customers happy. Or your users happy. That's kind of my litmus test of the effectiveness of a tool.
Yeah. And really look at the cost structure. I think one of the mistakes made with Hadoop is that companies looked at it and said, oh, I don't have to pay for a software license. Fantastic. And then they had to have these huge teams just to maintain their Hadoop clusters. And so they were spending, $1 million or more a year just on the team that would maintain that system. It's like, okay, it's not actually cheaper. It is cheaper in certain circumstances, but it's not automatically cheaper just to go with open source.
Well, right. And especially if you have a Hadoop stack you still need to maintain these days. I mean, it's getting to the point where I think finding good Hadoop developers is going to be like finding COBOL developers.
Yeah. So kids, if you want a job that pays well for the next few years, eventually that job might go away. But for now, go learn Hadoop and then go find a job maintaining someone's Hadoop stack.
Yeah. Or be like a Hadoop and COBOL expert. And just, So,
Hadoop on an IBM mainframe, maybe? I don't know. Is that a thing?
I'm sure somebody's done it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the second article real quick.
Yeah.
Snowflake had, I would say it's an interesting article, right? It's called Choosing Open Wisely. And it goes through Snowflake's opinions of open standards and open source software. So, and I think and at the end of the day, what they're arguing for is, look, just because things are open doesn't mean that we at Snowflake are going to use them. At the end of the day, we're going to try and optimize for making sure our customers get the best experience. And experience means obviously great usability, but also security, data governance, and so forth.
Yeah. And this file formats part really resonated with me. File formats discussion comes down to the traditional data lake. And in a traditional data lake, you just store all your data in files, and you want to be able to operate on those files with several different tools. So they need to be open file formats. The problem with this approach is that turns out a data lake without a lot of metadata and update management turns into a data black hole, like write once, read never pattern ultimately.
Yeah, for sure. Let me just reshare the article here real quick.
Okay.
Don't know why I turned it off actually. Yeah, so file formats, open protocols, and APIs is another one here. So
see, this part becomes much more compelling, maybe the code behind the scenes is not open source, but you have a vendor that's guaranteeing it, that contractually guarantees different aspects of what it can do, how secure that API is going to be if you follow their recommendations. And you're able to connect to that API and ingest data into other systems or push the API and get data into Snowflake, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think, to kind of fast forward here, kind of the punchline at the bottom. Where was that? Anyway, there's a quote here. I'll just read it. Open is a great collection of. Wait, where is that again? You remember that point? Is there?
Hold on. I'll look it up.
Oh, here. That's okay. Sorry, audience. Wait, here we go. Yeah. So right here. So this is respect to, talking about a foundation DB, which underpins a lot of Snowflake's architecture. But this quote I think is awesome. Open is a great collection of initiatives and processes, but it's just one of many tools. It's not the hammer to hit all nails and is the best choice only in some situations. In others, it hinders progress or is cynically presented as a higher calling to promote dubious causes. As always, customers must carefully consider which priorities are most important to them.
Yeah. There's a lot of open source evangelism, and not just in data. For example, some people argue that your smartphone should not have any code that is proprietary running on it. So you should have a smartphone that's open and then build all your own code on it. Well, the problem is that I have a job. We have a business to run. I don't have time to build all the code that runs on my phone. I don't have time to maintain it. I don't have time to make it secure. And I really want to just find someone who's going to provide me with a good experience as a service. And same thing, if you're talking about data systems, sometimes deploying open source makes sense, but do it where it makes sense for your business goals, not just out of some higher calling of purity around open code.
Right. And I was writing about this morning too, that, there's find areas where you have a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
And those are the areas where you should be writing your own proprietary code and systems, because literally that's the definition of a competitive advantage, is doing something others aren't. And if you're simply using open source across the board, without customizing certain aspects of it or creating custom libraries that aren't open source, just from a competitive angle in software, I don't know what advantage you have.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the problem is that a small startup looks at Google and says, oh, Google used Linux, they used open source software, and then they built everything in-house. Well, they're Google. They got a huge amount of venture funding. They grew at an extraordinary pace. Most startups are never going to have that growth curve and never going to have that scale.
Well, and so Google made those systems because it was a competitive advantage to them.
Right. There was nothing off the shelf available. They had to start from scratch. You don't have to. So figure out, exactly. What's your secret
sauce? They're solving Google solved Google's problems.
That's right.
Every company needs to go out and solve their problems too.
That's right. Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's funny. I saw another Hacker News discussion, I think yesterday or something, where people are arguing that you should build your own storage system because Cloudflare had a huge advantage because they'd gone all, on-prem. They built on their own hardware. And again, I'm like, well, they're Cloudflare. They're a massive company. You as a small startup shouldn't necessarily be doing that until you find that edge, that one piece of your business that gives you an advantage.
Yeah. And that said, I think this is where the arguments of the open data ecosystem are valid, right? Where for things that are not mission critical competitive advantage situations, plug and play best of breed technologies.
Yep.
Just do it with the caveat and the understanding that just because it's open doesn't mean it might be the best solution for you. You still need to understand your use cases and what tools are going to be most appropriate to you. So that also sort of underlies the fact that as technologists and data professionals, you need to understand the technologies you're implementing. And I know that seems obvious on the surface, but it's surprising how often this is glossed over.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think we all tend to engage in magical thinking and think that one tool is going to solve all of our problems or one philosophy. And nothing is ever that simple. Think carefully about the choices you're making. What's the interop? Can they talk to other things that you want to use in the future? And how do you escape in the future if you need to?
Right. And I think we'll maybe end it too talking about what we find interesting is there's this dichotomy right now too, because uh, the cloud is enabling this open data ecosystem at the same time. These clouds, and I'll lump Snowflake in with this. I mean, Snowflake's building its own data cloud, for example, right? Um, Snowflake is, if you look at a lot of the announcements, that they've been coming out with, it's going to be one data cloud to rule them all. And so that sort of implies they may have some technologies that, could potentially compete perhaps with, some of these open data solutions. The same thing happens in the other clouds, AWS, GCP, and Azure, right? And so, is the open data system, is it open data ecosystem that open, or, is it maybe a bit of an illusion or a bit of both? I don't know.
Yeah. And of course, you have to take into account other things too, right? Like egress fees. Like, yes, you can get any of your data out of AWS and GCP, but it's going to cost you money to get out. It's very simple APIs to move that data, but it comes with a big price tag. So keep that in mind too.
Yeah, there's no free lunch here.
Yeah.
So, but again, I think these are both, great articles. We'll post them in the show notes.
Yeah.
And, we just like reading articles like this and talking about them because I think it spurs our thinking as well as hopefully drives discussions. So, feel free to, watch the video, leave comments. If you like what we said, great. If you don't, awesome. Let's, leave a constructive reply.
Let's have a coherent argument. Yeah.
Yeah. But with that said, look forward to chatting next week about, I guess, whatever we're going to be talking about. Also on LinkedIn Live and YouTube Live, I think we're going to start doing Friday data engineering live Q&As. So stay tuned for those. We just did one on Friday with the Seattle data guy. Shout out to Ben Rogojan, really cool dude. So, and also the Monday Morning Data Chat is now a podcast. So you can get it on Anchor, Spotify, Google Play. Believe it's now on iTunes. So yeah, go check it out if you like the audio format of our discussions. I know this one in particular might be a bit kind of odd for audio format because we did a lot of screen sharing, but hopefully you followed along. So, well, cool. Anything else?
I think that's all I've got.
Awesome. Well, cool. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.
Take care.